I thought I would do something a little different on this channel and go through some of the best and most famous scenes from 1920s movies. This period of movies is often forgotten about, but it spawned some of the most influential scenes in the history of film. So if you're new to silent film, this would be a great introduction, and for those of you who already know it, it might be nice to revisit. But before I start the video, I want to stress that this isn't a ranked list, and I'm not going to promise that it's complete, but I did my best. And I also didn't include scenes from shorts, only ones from full-length movies. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's get into it. First, I want to start with one of my absolute favorites. This sequence from Buster Keaton's 1924 movie Sherlock Jr. is a masterclass in slapstick comedy. This wasn't among his most dangerous stunts, more on those later, but the amount of time and effort to accomplish it was incredible. Keaton often set up the most elaborate gags maybe in the history of comedy. So, for this scene, he had to use surveying equipment to position himself exactly in the same position so that when they had to cut and make a new background appear, he was in as close to the same exact position as possible to make it look more realistic. This was especially tricky when the background changed while he was still moving. It's the kind of thing we can easily take for granted now, but back then, there were only so many special effects that could be done. They just had to be creative with what they had. And this whole scene is also pretty meta with him just hopping into a movie screen like that. And it's pretty cool to see the musical accompaniment going on while everything is happening. They literally just saw a person jump into a movie, and they just kinda rolled with it. I just love everything about this, and I never get tired of watching it. And before someone calls me out for this, yes, I know it's a dream sequence, but it's still amazing how absurd it is. In that same movie, Keaton also performed one of the most dangerous stunts of his career, and that's saying a lot for him. After he holds on to this water spout, it turns on and smashes him to the floor. Even though he gets up and looks like he's okay, you just saw Buster Keaton fracture his neck. What's worse is that he didn't even find out about that until many years later. For weeks after he performed the stunt, he suffered from terrible headaches. The fact that this man made it out of the 1920s alive is incredible, and you'll be even more surprised after you hear about all of his other near-death experiences while filming. In the 1925 movie, The Freshman, Harold Lloyd's character has tried his best to become a somebody on his college campus. He thought the best way to do this was to join the football team and impress the girl that he has a crush on. Although the girl is sympathetic to him, other people on campus don't really take him seriously and laugh at his clumsiness. In the climactic football game, Harold's team is getting pummeled, and there are a lot of injuries, but the score remains very close. The coach has to come up with another player to put in the game or he has to forfeit. With Harold being the only real option left, he puts him in. He also gets pummeled, but with a lot of motivation, he picks up a fumble and runs it down the field. He gets dogpiled right at the end, but when everyone on the other team gets up, it's revealed that Harold is holding the ball right over the line. His team and their fans burst into jubilation, and he's hailed as the football hero of the campus. I love this ending, but also the journey to get there. The Freshman is one of my favorite 1920s movies, and I highly recommend it for beginners who want to get into them. The next one has a very different mood, but it's pretty relevant considering the movie was just remade. There are a few scenes in the 1922 movie Nosferatu that could be considered great, but I think this one is the best because it really brings out the German expressionist element. Directed by the legendary F.W. Murnau, this scene shows the vampire Nosferatu, or rather his very stylized shadow, creeping up the stairs and slowly reaching out for the doorknob. He goes into the room where one of the main characters is awaiting his arrival in fear. She knew he was coming. By this time in the movie, we've already seen what he looks like, but making him only a shadow in this scene was absolute genius. After he enters her room, the shadow of his hand then creeps up the woman's chest and clutches on her heart, causing her to faint. A lot of people today are probably desensitized to horror stuff, but just imagine that scene back in 1922. Terrifying. The next scene is by no means an artistic masterpiece like the one in Nosferatu, but it's one of the most played scenes of any 1920s movie, so there's a very good chance you've seen this one before. Jack Robin, also known as Jakey Rabinowitz, was Al Jolson's iconic character from the 1927 movie The Jazz Singer. And the words,
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet,"
ushered in the talkie revolution, when the entire film industry very quickly abandoned silent films and went toward the future of talking pictures. There had been no guarantee that this would happen, but The Jazz Singer proved to be a big financial success. While it wasn't the first moving picture with synchronized sound, and wasn't even a full talkie, it featured some spoken dialogue, which was a hit with audiences, and demonstrated that talking pictures could be financially viable for movie studios to produce, and worth the massive investment. This next one is definitely in the top 3 most famous movie scenes of the entire silent era. Harold Lloyd was a consistent box office smash throughout the 1920s, but the thing he's best known for is hanging from a big clock near the top of a tall building in the 1923 movie Safety Last. The whole sequence of him trying to prove himself by being a human fly is great in its entirety, but this was the most climactic part, when his character almost fell to his death. Even people who don't know much about the 1920s or the history of film have probably seen this sometime in their life. In reality, this was shot by having a facade of the building on top of a real building. But just imagine walking through Los Angeles and seeing a big movie star filming those scenes. And you could if you were there at that time, because it was actually out in public. The building this was filmed on top of was the Broadway Leasehold Building in Los Angeles, which is still there even today. Here's another Buster Keaton scene. The first one I showed wasn't really one of his dangerous stunts, but this one was pretty dangerous. In his comedy drama, Our Hospitality from 1923, Keaton ties himself at the waist with a rope and jumps from a waterfall to save his girl, played by his real wife, Natalie Talmadge. Talmadge, though, did not perform such stunts, so she was replaced with an inanimate doll thing for Keaton to grab hold of. Keaton, always being his own stuntman, almost died during the filming of this movie. While filming a different but similar scene on location, he almost drowned in a river when the rope holding him up broke and he plunged into the water below, and was found unconscious but alive. He then proceeded to film this waterfall scene in a studio. With Keaton, there are a surprising number of stories like this. Okay, this next one was especially famous for its special effects. Cecil B. DeMille's 1923 movie, The Ten Commandments, provided a biblical lesson for viewers, which was DeMille's MO for many of his most famous movies. Although the section depicting biblical times was only part of the movie, it left a longer-lasting impression. It depicted the famous parting of the Red Sea by Moses, and was made by playing the film of the water backwards, then double exposing it with footage of the Israelites walking through it. And if you look closely, you'll notice that on each side of the pathway, there's a faint jiggling. Well, that was Jell-O. So, one of the greatest special effects of the decade was made possible through Jell-O. I guess that's your fun fact of the day. Another scene that was burned into the minds of people in the 1920s was this one in The Kid from 1921. Unfortunately, this clip has been copyright claimed, though not apparently by the Chaplin estate, so I'm not sure if it's really legitimate, but I have to show still images for this one. Here, Charlie Chaplin's tramp character has his unofficially adopted son taken away from him by men from an orphanage after it's discovered that he isn't really the boy's father. I've said this before in previous videos, but I'm always impressed by the acting of Jackie Coogan in this scene. Not many child actors can do this kind of anguished sobbing so convincingly, but Jackie was really top tier for his age. And the kid also jump-started his career. Personally, whenever I think of this movie, this is the image that comes to mind first. The movie as a whole was also a great example of how Charlie Chaplin could make audiences laugh and tug on their heartstrings so effectively. This next one might be new to you because it's from a movie not well known outside of silent movie buffs, but it has a high rating from film historians. It's from a 1926 Japanese movie called A Page of Madness. And it's a very unsettling image that really seems to have influenced future Japanese horror movies, which have a very different aesthetic than many Western ones. And then the image of everyone wearing those traditional no masks are just as unsettling. Calling this scene one of the most famous of the 1920s might be a little bit of a stretch, especially since it's not a mainstream one and is mostly only famous in retrospect, but let me know if you have an opinion about that. I've just seen it a number of times in film history documentaries. The movie as a whole is very artistic, with no intertitles at all, so you have to understand everything through the visuals alone. If you want to see a 1920s movie that's very different from what was normal, this is it. Here we have another Buster Keaton scene. Hey, don't blame me, he had a lot of memorable ones. These days, Keaton's most famous movie is probably The General from 1926, though it wasn't thought so at the time of its release. But in the almost 100 years since, it has reclaimed a lasting legacy. And the most famous scene is near the end, when this train goes onto a bridge that was set on fire and crashes into the water below. Apparently, this scene cost an estimated $42,000 to film, making it one of the most expensive scenes of any silent film. It was filmed in Cottage Grove, Oregon, and the train wreckage was left in the water until it was scrapped during World War II. Rudolph Valentino. His name alone could make a woman swoon in the 1920s, and the iconic tango scene in the 1921 movie The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse is what started it all. Pretty much everything that women loved about him on screen is represented right here, and at the time, it was something new. In this scene, with a ton of swagger, Rudy tries to cut in during a dance, but is brushed off by the man. When they start to resume their stiff, old-fashioned dance, Rudy tosses the man aside and takes the girl he wants, which really gives her a thrill, and does the tango with her. It was an exotic and intimate dance that involved pressing their bodies close together. And, fun fact, Valentino had actually worked as a paid dancer at clubs before he worked in movies. And yes, he danced the tango then, too. The dance is topped with a romantic kiss. Before he was the Sheik, Valentino was Julio, a role that immediately launched him into the highest ranks of Hollywood. It also started a tango craze. Yes, another 1920s craze. Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush from 1925 was singled out by the man himself as his greatest film achievement, and it certainly has a lot of memorable moments. Unfortunately, this was the only movie in this video that gave me copyright problems, so I'll have to use still images for this one, as much as I hate to do that. This first one shows him and his housemate, both of whom came to the Klondike during the gold rush in the 1890s, and are living in such squalor that they have run out of food. So the tramp decides to cook his own boot. They both gnaw at the leather, with the tramp even slurping up a shoelace like spaghetti. The other most famous scene from this movie is the iconic dinner roll dance. The tramp stabs 2 dinner rolls with forks and makes it look like he's dancing, with a comedically disproportionately large head. He does this to impress a group of women, especially his love interest in the movie. The problem is, none of this is real, it's a dream, which is emotionally devastating to the viewer. This is the kind of stuff that Chaplin was renowned for, making you laugh, then cry, and in this instance, he did it in one amazing scene. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. The 1920 film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari had one of the most influential set designs of all time. If you compare it to other movies from around the same time, it's extremely unique in style. Even more so than Nosferatu, this movie oozes German expressionism. The buildings and environment are jagged and distorted looking, and that's because, well, I won't ruin the ending, but I will say that it's great. Anyway, this scene is reminiscent of Nosferatu. Well, it's actually the other way around, since Dr. Caligari came out in 1920. The main character creeps up on the sleeping main woman character, almost plunges a knife into her, then decides to take her away instead. Another amazing example of dark tension that German expressionist films did so well. If there's one scene in any 1920s movie that could be considered the most famous and influential by film historians, it's almost definitely the stairs sequence from the 1925 Russian film Battleship Potemkin, directed by Sergei Eisenstein. It's the prime example of the Soviet montage technique. We take this for granted now, but montages hadn't always been a thing, and Soviet filmmakers pioneered and mastered this innovation. And by montage, I don't mean those goofy ones from 80s movies. Original montages focused on how images were edited together and how they connected or related to each other, rather than just showing a sequence of images. Most film experts give this sequence a chef's kiss. And talk about tension. The fleeing civilians juxtaposed with the marching soldiers, guns drawn. The brutal murder of people. The most famous part of the sequence is the baby stroller. The mother is shot and killed, and she accidentally pushes the stroller down the stairs. It rolls and rolls and rolls, leading to an explosive and gruesome climax. If you've dabbled in film as an art form, then you've likely seen this face from the 1928 film The Passion of Joan of Arc. Renee Jean Falconetti's performance in this movie is considered one of the best in the history of film. She plays Joan of Arc, and a large percentage of this movie consists of close-ups of her face, showing the wide range of her emotions. But the scenes where she's crying are the ones that you usually see in documentaries and things like that. Falconetti's performance overall is really just a masterclass in facial acting, and for people who think that silent movie acting was always over the top, this is a perfect counter to that. It's also a much more artistic movie than your typical Hollywood movie of the same time, being directed by Carl Theodor Dreyer. So, like the other more artistic European films on this list, it's probably not for everyone, but I digress. This is probably Buster Keaton's most famous stunt, from the 1928 movie Steamboat Bill Jr. Unbeknownst to his character, a hurricane starts to hit, and the strong winds throw him all around as he lays on a bed. He's scooted into a horse barn before being deposited roughly outside in front of a building. The front of the building is breaking off from the rest of the structure, though he doesn't know that. He stands up, trying to find his bearings, and in a stunt that easily could have killed him instantly if it had gone wrong, the whole front of the building falls on him. But he's saved because he's standing right where there's an empty window hole. Okay, so there's some context for this scene from the 1927 movie Metropolis, but I'll try to really simplify it for brevity. So there's this scientist guy named Rotwang, who's built a robot that can take the image of people. And he's ordered to make the robot resemble a woman for reasons I don't want to say in order not to spoil the movie. I would really hate to ruin a movie of this caliber for someone who's never watched it. So anyway, here Rotwang is bringing the robot to life in a kind of weird take on Frankenstein. I'm sure you've seen this scene somewhere. It's one of the most iconic sci-fi looking things from the silent era. Its aesthetic has been really influential and an amazing piece of retrofuturism. There are some other scenes from this movie that are also pretty famous, and I might as well include one of them here. The other one that comes to mind the most is the scene showing the futuristic city. The place isn't just a static image though, it's bustling with vehicles. Obviously, this was made with special effects, more specifically miniatures, but considering the time it was made, it looks shockingly good. It's another iconic piece of retrofuturistic art. The movie as a whole is considered one of the greatest films ever made in any era. In other words, it's a masterpiece. This scene from the 1929 movie Pandora's Box by German director G.W. Pabst is pretty much a spoiler in itself, so just a fair warning if you want to watch the movie with a blank slate. It depicts the main character Lulu completing her tragic arc. She has become a prostitute, and unfortunately, her next customer is a mentally unstable murderer. After resisting the urge to kill her, he eventually goes through with it in this beautifully shot scene that just drips with tension. Instead of being graphically shown, we just see Lulu's hand go limp. Louise Brooks's performance as Lulu is her greatest legacy on film. Ben-Hur from 1925, according to one source I found, was the third highest grossing movie of the 1920s. It's hard to emphasize how big this movie was, and for its age, is still remembered pretty well. It had a budget of $4 million, which was an insane amount for a 1920s movie. And its most memorable scene, one of the greatest Hollywood scenes of all time, is the chariot race. With 12 chariots, 48 horses, and 42 cameramen, it's filled with high-speed action. And with all those cameras, there's a wide range of angles. Views of the drivers, side views of the running horses, and even from underneath the chariots as they race above. It's easy to take these things for granted today, but this was the peak of thrill when it was released in 1925. According to actor Francis X. Bushman, in the crash in this scene, no actors were killed, but 5 horses were. Don't worry, I'm not going to show that part, but you can easily watch the full movie online. The next movie has been deemed a masterpiece in the present day, King Vidor's 1928 movie, The Crowd. First, we see shots of the hustle and bustle of a big city in quick succession, showing the scale and size, with so many people that it's easy to get lost in the crowd. Then, an artistic, weird angle of skyscrapers, before ascending the menacingly tall building, going up, 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 high above the insanely busy city, where more busy people are bound to be. And in a wonderful establishing shot, our main character is introduced after a long shot goes closer and closer to him. One man among a huge crowd of seemingly identical workers. He has a name, but also a number, which is a bit dehumanizing. The movie really gives a man in the gray flannel suit feeling for its highly conformist setting. It's kind of hard for many of us now to understand the influence that the director D.W. Griffith had in the early movie industry. Some really bad, Birth of a Nation, but some good stuff too. The early 1920s was kind of his last hurrah in terms of relevance, and he started the decade off in 1920 with a very popular movie, Way Down East. In this climactic scene, Richard Barthelmess's character has to save the woman he loves, played by Lillian Gish. She's lying immobile on an ice floe, with Lillian herself adding the nice touch of dipping her hair and hand into the freezing water to create a more pathetic image. This was filmed outside, and the weather and water were actually really cold. Doing this scene actually damaged Gish's hand permanently, and she would suffer that discomfort for over 70 years. And by the way, this scene was filmed on location in White River Junction in Vermont, just in case you're interested. Alright, so those were all the scenes that came to mind, some of them being more famous than others. But what do you think? Which of these scenes is your favorite and why? I'm sure I didn't cover every single famous scene from the 1920s, but I think I definitely hit the biggest ones. But if I missed something, please let me know in the comments. I have some other scenes that didn't quite make the cut for this video, but I'd love to make another video like this showing those maybe a little bit lesser known ones. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.